It's one thing to learn anatomy, it's another to learn how to draw people. And I think drawing people is mostly about understanding how people move, how people act. This is where what we need to do as artists is create a sense of posture, of balance within the figure. What I want to do in this video is tackle that concept. How do we make the figure not just feel grounded, but feel as if they're balanced and get used to being able to position the feet and adjust the balance of the figure as we do that in order to create the right emotion. You might need to create feelings of aggression, of sort of a martial artist or a warrior. You might need to create feelings of someone being sort of afraid or timid. A lot of this comes down to, again, how people hold themselves, and a lot of how people hold themselves comes down to where their feet are. In this video, what I want to do is focus on, again, how do we control foot position? How does that relate to how the body sort of adjusts and moves the hips and the torso to adjust for that? And how can you sort of use these tools to start practicing drawing your own poses that kind of make sense, feel grounded, and have the right emotion? Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we are all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like more information on line and color illustration, you can check out my free Quick Start Guide. This is designed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop using the line and color style. I go from the thumbnail to the finished image, and you'll also get all of my brushes and PSDs and most of the things that I use day in, day out as a professional artist. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. All right, so I have done a previous video that introduces this concept that talked about how to create grounded characters. And in that video, if you haven't seen it already, there'll be a link in the description. What I talked about was essentially positioning the feet on the ground and just how to handle that basic task. The question often becomes, once you get comfortable with that, how do you start to actually begin to create more interesting foot positions and patterns of sort of holding weight? In that video, it was all about making sure that you can draw an upright character, but people often sort of, move and sway, and the body does interesting things to compensate. Typically, your body just will respond to these positioning, balance sort of adjustments naturally. You kind of will go where your sort of head points, right? If you just kind of, like step forward, your body will automatically adjust, right? If you just kind of like keep tilting forward, eventually your leg will just kind of go out, whether you like it or not. It takes a lot of focus to kind of just fall over, right? You have to try and do it. You have to try and just fall and face plant, right? Your body is going to try and naturally balance itself. And as artists, what we need to do is study not just this balance, but have some solid techniques for how to translate that balance to our own drawings. Now, obviously, if you extrapolate a lot of this out, you can see that we would be using the same concepts for all sorts of poses, and a lot of them could be very dynamic. What I want to focus on in this lesson is mostly just how we slightly shift the balance, because again, the goal here is to give you a bite-sized exercise that you can actually play with. And we don't want to get too complicated. Again, that's something we can handle in subsequent videos. So this is going to be about how do we just sort of make subtle adjustments to the posture based on foot position and based on torso and hip adjustments to the balance to make sure that, again, people feel balanced. Once you master this, it will become a lot easier to then start putting people in specific poses, right? Because you start to think in terms of where are the feet And then when you look at people doing stuff, you start to think about where their feet are. And once you do that and you start to sort of think about the balance, it becomes a lot easier to actually position people relative to the ground plane and relative to each other. So this is another little step along a larger journey, but I think it's a really important bite-sized exercise to really sink your teeth into and get good at. So anyway, let's jump in over to the drawing table and get started. All right, and here we are at the drawing table. So my tools for today are some matte black wings, variety of sizes and levels of sharpness, and I'm going to be sketching on some Strathmore 400 series recycled sketch paper, which again is okay for this, but not for doing finished illustrations. I'm also going to be going a little bit quicker because these little drawings here where we're playing around with, essentially a really sort of formalized structural sort of gesture, do start to feel a little bit more like gesture drawings. And that is kind of the point. The way that I think of this type of drawing is through gesture. But I'm not sort of trying to feel flow. I'm not trying to sort of get some sense of sort of flowy gesture or to kind of understand the flow of the figure. What I'm doing is I've got a very static skeleton here. I've got a very sort of boring figure, and it's my job to just position this in the correct way so that we get some sense of emotion, so that the character is feeling and posed and balanced in a particular manner. So I'm going to move a little bit faster than I have in some of the previous videos. If you want to check those out and get a little bit better of an understanding of how I am proportioning the figure, go do that, because again, this is a matter of building blocks. We start with the first block where we focus on accuracy. You learn how to draw the little figure. And then the next one, again, we start to balance it, and then we start to move, and then we start to, again, once you're, at the more sophisticated levels of that structure, you start to draw this a lot quicker and hopefully to maintain some level of accuracy. But in general, the goal here is to get accurate gesture drawings that we can actually sort of use for real work, whereas often I find gesture drawings are good for gesture to sort of practice, sort of loosening up and stuff. What we want to do is understand posture through drawing our little stick figure and then be able to kind of actually build muscles onto that. So we're dealing with a static, boring, emotional figure, and our job is to inject character and emotion and drama into it. So how do we do that? Well, let's look at the basics of, again, what's happening when we start to adjust and twist posture. So if we look at this from the side, often when we are considering our sort of normal, typical posture, we're actually taking into consideration quite a bit of this sort of natural sense of balance anyway, right? We often have a sort of torso, we've got a head, right? We've sort of got a torso here somewhere, and it's often this flow that people are talking about, these kind of S curves, where we have the spine having a little bit of a flow to it. And it's often this balancing of the actual primary forms that we are dealing with and will sort of help us make the figure feel balanced. So again, the head is to some degree sort of pointing this way. The torso is to a certain degree pointing this way, and the pelvis is to a certain degree pointing this way. All I will say about this general idea, which you have maybe heard before and seen people sort of talk about, is what this will do is help you to get that flow. It will help us to get that feeling of balance. But in many cases, people aren't actually that sort of flowy, right? So if we look at the skeleton figure we've got here, yes, you can see there is an S-curve, right? You can see that there is a sense of that sort of balance, of a springiness to it. But, if you look at the posture, this sort of, character, person, thing is meant to have a fairly upright posture. And you can see it's very straight up and down, right? The person is not kind of slouching, right? They're not sort of resting on their bones to a certain degree. And often what happens is, again, people with good posture are going to, have a fairly upright posture. Their muscles are holding up their entire body. But nevertheless, this idea is really useful. All I would say is don't take it too far and, sort of start to really exaggerate the S-curve too much, because it makes it feel more flowy, and it sort of makes us feel that sense of sort of weight and posture. But from my experience, it's a little bit too exaggerated to use in most cases, right? What we're doing is understanding this concept, then we're dialing it right down so that it might feel a little bit more realistic. Again, especially if you're trying to draw things realistically. But it is often this sort of sense of there being a rhythm, right? A rhythm of balance that we want to sort of pay attention to when we're drawing our figures. And from the side, that's often what we're doing, right? We are drawing it from the side, and we're taking into consideration, right, this kind of flow that is, sort of balancing the weights. And as I was saying in the introduction, if you move some of these things, the rest are going to sort of move to adjust. So to a small degree, right, if you move your torso and you sort of twist it one way, your pelvis is going to move in, another way to kind of keep the balance, and your spine might sort of twist a little bit. So it's often this that we're sort of building into our, normal pose. And if you checked out the grounded character video, that's what we were doing, just statically. So this character is static, but there is still a good sense of balance there. So the point here is you can practice these concepts even with a very stiff, static figure. Even if you're just drawing, again, that kind of basic skeleton guy, you're still practicing all of these concepts, even if they're not moving around, even if nothing sort of fancy is happening. But let's look at what we're going to deal with today, which is what sort of happens from the front when you have movement of the feet. So again, the idea here is, if we just sort of sketch this in roughly, this is what the character, and again, this will be sort of very faint. All right, we have a figure like this, and if they're just standing, then we would have some feet, something like this. Now, the question is, if we look at the center of balance there, right, that seems pretty centralized, that's working. But what happens when, again, the person moves their feet around? So what could happen is, again, they're going to move this foot back here, but they're going to move it, like a little bit closer to that center line, right? So we've got this leg being kind of here. And then what if they move this leg all the way over here? Then you're going to get something that looks like this. Now, because this is drawing, we can kind of just make this leg a little bit longer. But what's actually often happening is that the pelvis is tilting. And what would happen is that, again, the pelvis would be sort of tilted, and I'm exaggerating this again. Similar concept here to illustrate the purpose. But these subtle balance shifts are happening at a very, 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 very subtle level all the time. So, even if you're just doing very subtle adjustments, not, giant feet out into the middle of nowhere, you'll still get these subtle things, but it might just be a very, very subtle change. But here we're going to exaggerate it, and this entire demo, we're probably exaggerating things because it helps us see it. So what's probably going to happen there is that, again, to contrast this, the sort of shoulders and this torso is going to rotate this way. All right. So what we would have normally had is torso like this, right, straight, right, head, and then we would have had pelvis like this, straight, straight, straight. Now, what we're going to have here is that these are going to get tilted in, right? So this goes down, and this goes up. And that'll typically happen over the leg that is kind of now bearing most of the weight, i.e. the leg that is kind of centralized under the center of balance. So what does that look like from the front? How is this kind of, working from the front? From the front, again, we've got our torso, we've got a line down here, we've got some shoulders, we have a head up here, got pelvis muscle, bone thing, right? Again, this is our static pose here, right? Bump, bump, right? Foot, right? We got something like this. So that's normally what we're looking at. Now, if we sort of change that to represent this balance, and these are pretty simple concepts. You may have sort of seen these things talked about previously on either other sort of art books or other art channels. This is sort of the common understanding of what sort of happens. So it's typically that the pelvis is going to have a direction like that, and the shoulders are going to extend that way. So what's happening is we've got our torso here, our pelvis here, and this is going to now have a slightly different tilt to it, right? And this leg, it's going to come a little bit closer to the center of balance here, and maybe this one, right, is coming out a little bit. Oh, that should be the wrong way. That should be the other way, actually. Let's get this right. This one is going that way, and this one is going that way. So yeah, sorry, my apologies, getting it all mixed up. But you could see how, again, that felt a little bit wrong when we had it balanced the other way. So in this case, I've got this leg coming down here. This is my center, boom, and again, we can just, if we just sort of let these arms drop, which is, again, a little bit sort of awkward, but that's, probably what will sort of happen to those as well. All right, we're going to get some sort of balance like that. Now, what's also going to happen is you start to get these sort of lines of balance going this way, similar to what we have on the front, right? We now have a line that's going to go a little bit this way, and probably the head might either be tilted a little bit to compensate, or at least we'll have a little bit of flow in the neck. So we're often seeing the same thing here. We're seeing that these lines will kind of start to balance each other out. Again, very subtly, probably not as much as we've got here. So all we need to do is sort of think about how this functions in 3 dimensions, because if we understand, again, these things in 2 dimensions, and often we can just start to build them into 3 dimensions and then think about posture. But it's these basic adjustments that we're making to the posture and the position of the torso and everything else that make up the sense of posture. And again, all that we would do to create more sophisticated postures is again, play around with the position of the head. Again, we can imagine. All right, I had a few audio issues with the recording, so I'm going to do a voiceover to explain the most important thing once you're sort of comfortable positioning the body and understanding these basic tenets is to think about these flows, but to not exaggerate them too much. This is where you need to think and look at reference, but look at the real world. This is where you need to pay close attention to specifically and exactly how people are standing. This is one of those things that I find is, an unfortunate truth. No drawing book is going to teach you how people move. You have to go out and look for it on your own. You have to do your own research in this instance. And that should make sense because drawing teachers are not movement specialists. And the most important thing here is to understand that what you want to do is build your own understanding of the world. You don't want a drawing teacher's view of how people move. You want to build your own. You want to be interested in specifically how do the characters that you want to create, how does the style that you want to create, how does everything that you're into move, and how do you actually build your own unique style using those building blocks. If you understand that, then I think it's going to help you a lot more than, again, looking for sort of general advice of how do people move, how do people sort of sit. Don't ask an artist. You need to get out there and slightly get your hands dirty and understand how these things function on your own. All right, let's do a few examples. One of the main points here that I want to get across is that figures are essentially built out of static objects. And you've often sort of seen people discuss the concept of gesture drawing, right? Where we are taking really flowy lines and we're thinking about movement. My point here is that bodies that look like they're in motion are made up of very hard bones. And your job is not necessarily to play around with sort of bending things and figuring out, exactly how to kind of push your line of action and sort of squash and stretch everything. That can be really useful from an animation standpoint, but keep in mind that bodies that feel like they're in motion are made up of skeletons that don't bend that much. And a big part of what you have to do is understand how to position these static objects to make it feel like we have a great sense of motion. Not necessarily to draw really sort of squiggly lines and, try and sort of cheat. You can make amazing figures just by moving the skeleton. All right, so I'm going to start laying out the basic proportions of the figure. Now, the goal here and the point is that we want to make sure that I'm showing you how these figures would be if they're static. And the next step is to sort of move them and manipulate them. What I want to talk about here, though, is how you can potentially shortcut and figure out what to draw first. Mannequins and the idea of drawing stick figures, following the concepts that you would find in Andrew Loomis's sort of drawing books and other how to draw things, really come at the core of the fact that these mannequins and figures and sketches are meant to be the most easy, effective thing that you can do to plan a drawing. And depending on what you're doing, you may need to use different aspects to help plan. So this is where, again, one of the most important things for posture is actually these lines that sort of define the shoulders and the things that define the line of the hips. So it's actually often, a matter of optimizing for what is going to help you pose the character first. So again, what we'll do here is we'll think carefully about where is the general center of balance of a fairly static standing character. We're not dealing with dynamic movement in any of this demo. The thing here is to be able to sort of change where the feet go a little bit and not have everything fall apart. That is the goal for today. So in this case, again, I have the rough knee position, but what I'm going to do is sort of imagine that the person actually sort of has one leg kind of positioned in, right? So it's actually kind of standing almost on that center of balance, right? And I'm just going to sort of have it be kind of coming out. Now, the other one, I'm going to want to sort of put somewhere over here. Now let's keep it still on this line. So we're not thinking about, again, three-dimensionality too much. Let's just place it over here. So again, what we'll have, I find even though you often might want a little bit of gesture, right, a little bit of movement or, sort of balance to your sort of legs, start with a straight line because it's a lot easier to kind of say, well, I need to go from here to here, and then you can sort of draw those gestures. Same thing with the sort of arms, right? Let's start just with a very simple here to here and then add the gesture. I find that works a lot better. So here you can see again, this actually will work. It's not so far out. There's a little bit of mobility here, you know, in terms of just sort of where the hips are placed and balance. But typically what you'll sort of find is that in order for this to, you know, be balanced, we're gonna move this line down a little bit, right? So we're gonna have one hip here, and that allows this leg to kind of stretch out a little bit more. Otherwise it doesn't make sense because your leg can't just sort of rubber band out. And so what this does from a basic structural perspective is, again, if we sort of think of that sort of pelvic line, which I'm indicating with 2 discs there, right? It's better to simplify that even further, especially if you're struggling, into just sort of a toilet roll cylindrical form, right? That's kind of what we're drawing. And again, what we do is kind of put those plates within it, and you know, then sort of build the rest of the structure there. But it all starts with, again, simple cylindrical or box form. Some people are a lot more comfortable, you know, literally drawing a box form for this, right? You might want to, you know, start with the idea of, you know, building box forms for the torso, box forms for the pelvis, right? That might be a much better, and again, box form for the head. I just tend to be a little bit more of a, you know, sort of flowy, sort of, you know, I like drawing sort of egg shapes and spherical shapes, basically. So the cylinders work better for me. But if boxes work better for you, or it helps you think, then do that. So that is all to say that often what we need to visualize and think about is this cylindrical object. How does the fact that one hip is down, right, affect the general sort of feeling? And you want to either literally put in or feel or visualize the fact that this line, again, if we were to sort of look at that from the front, right, bump, bump, right, we're looking at how these lines change. That's kind of what we're trying to visualize. What direction do these lines go in? And again, this is going to change to counteract, as we sort of talked about before. And maybe the torso will sort of change a little bit as well. Right, so much of this is about, you know, working on your form drawing, but you can get away with a lot just from, you know, practicing this way. And you know, this is where, again, you know, you can practice rendering form, right? Really thinking about where the light and shadow of your form is going to be, etc. But you know, practicing using tasks like this is also a really good way to sort of play around with it. Just practice drawing spherical objects and defining, you know, the sort of geometry or the topology of what is actually, you know, pointing where. And it's often just these lines that we then use to find structure on top of. Again, I will do some, you know, videos at some point on the channel about sort of rendering and stuff. So here is the basic construction that you can see. Again, we've got that going that way, and so from the front, right, we've got this going that way, and this is going that way. And again, you know, we're often gonna, that means the spine is going to twist a little bit. And as I said, you know, you might find that the head twists a little bit this way to adjust, but it's probably not going to be as much as you imagine, right? If in doubt, if you just kind of draw it straight up, you'll probably find things will kind of work okay. And then the next thing is to think about where these other sort of limbs are going to go. Now, this is exactly where looking at reference of real people is useful. If you want to draw people doing, you know, large movements, then go check the reference, right? when someone puts their hand on the hip, as I had in that other example, right? Got a hand on my hip, right? Where does that elbow go in three-dimensional space? Is it back here? Right? Is it out on the side? And, do they put it on this hip or do they put it on this hip? Which one do you want? And does that feel awkward? To a certain degree, you can make these things up. And because we have sort of mirror neurons, and we, especially if you get used to drawing these little skeleton figures, you start to feel the posture. And this is where, again, your instinct will come in, as my instinct came in before when I was sort of drawing. I drew the leg going the wrong way, right? It was sort of the balance was on the wrong hip. And that's where what's happening is your mirror neurons are sort of putting themselves in the position of this figure, and you're feeling a little bit of the awkwardness of what that sort of figure or pose would be. So that's where, you have the concept of intuition coming from. So you can just draw these figures and use your intuition to be like, does this feel right? Does that not feel right? But it is really good to then look at reference and start to fill in those gaps. And this, in my opinion, again, is a huge reason why looking at reference is useful, but not in the way that, people are often thinking or saying. So it's less that you look at reference, or I look at reference, or I would suggest you look at reference and, just sort of copy the pose. What I would suggest you do is to look at the pose and, record all of those positions of the skeleton or those basic points that you tend to manipulate. You'll only be able to do that and look at reference from doing these kind of exercises first, and then kind of going, hey, where do people put their, elbow when they've got their hand on the hip? How far up does this shoulder joint come, when someone's, raising their arm? How much does the position of the torso to the pelvis change? Once you create a void, right? Create a void for information. Right? That's when you look at reference and you suck up that information. You have questions now because you've tried to do this. You're trying to think about it. Then when you look at someone dancing or doing those things, your brain will try and find those answers. And this is, again, the opposite way of using reference that I think a lot of people are suggesting. What I'm saying is you try it first, you fail, then you look at reference, because in my opinion, then your brain is going to soak that reference up better. If you look at reference first and then try and then fail, you're creating a different loop that is less useful for you being able to imagine figures, right? And create figures from your imagination. Might be a great loop for, using heavy reference in your art, but that's, again, not what I'm focusing on. All right, let's do a few more. So there's an infinite number of sort of things we could try. But, something that I think we could sort of play with is the idea, again, also of twisting the torso versus the pelvis further in 3 dimensions. Now, this is where what we might have, and this is also where I'd sort of talk about the best way to kind of start these drawings. Again, let's think about beginning our posture with these lines so that we can sort of really imagine where they're going. But what I'm going to do here is actually sort of twist that torso around a little bit. Again, I have that line visualized to begin with. I'm not exactly sure whether that's the ground plane that it kind of sets the grid. I'll have to find out once I put the legs down. So I'm not always placing these marks down here knowing exactly where the legs are going to be, although you can measure that in. What I'm doing here is I'm kind of imagining that those hips are twisted this way. And this is where, again, previously, right, we might have that cylinder, right, like this, but now we're drawing it a bit more, right, like this. And what we need to do now is think about how that affects the position of the feet. So a good thing to do that will always help is just drop down some lines to the ground and kind of get a feel for where those feet would be. right? The next thing I'm going to do is, again, say, well, this is kind of going this way a little bit. So again, to look from the side, right? That's going that way. And then that means the hips are going that way. Right, so that's going up a little bit, just a little bit though, and this one's going down just a little bit. So that means, again, I'm going to have balance on this one, and I'm going to try the same thing here. I'm going to place the figure, I'm going to place the foot a little bit closer to this line here. Right, so let's sort of do that. Boom, got that figure here. And now, again, we can sort of visualize roughly where that sort of knee is going to be. And let's put this, again, put this leg a little bit out. Boom, boom. But this torso is going to face us a little bit more. Again, I'm exaggerating it. I'm exaggerating that facing us more so that it's a little bit easier to see. Right? And then again, we could sort of drop those arms down. Right, roughly sort of somewhere there. Or we could, again, sort of move them. Right, have the character holding something. Again, let's visualize where that would be. Try and place those things along. Right, where would this be sitting over the ground? Staff or something. And yeah, this one, well, right, again, let's add a little bit of that gesture to those arms, and bang, sort of head up here. Right, so you can see here I'm slowly ratcheting up the complexity of this, because this is actually quite a complicated task. We're sort of moving fully in 3 dimensions, and your job is to kind of track all of these bits and pieces. And I mean, let me know in the comments, but to me, again, the more I explain this, the more I'm just like, man, this starts to get really complicated. And that's why you need to take it one step at a time. Really, really think about how these things are going to sort of like affect your overall development, and just, realize that this is that foundational thing, right? We build one big block, which is like, how do I just draw character, sitting up straight? And then the next one is, how do we adjust the posture? And the next one, and obviously underneath this, is how do I draw a mannequin in the first place? And once you kind of get competent with each step, then adding this complexity seems kind of a little bit easier. So we're managing complexity here. But the thing is, once you do this, once you actually have all of this mapped out, you basically have all the ingredients that you're going to need to create a really, really finished image on top of this, a really good base that you can then go and build muscle and build character on top of. It's more important to think about these things, even though calculating a lot of these proportions is really, really tricky. It's more important than worrying too much about gesture drawing or sort of, getting really sort of flowy sketches, because often what you actually need is, again, a good sense of the ground plane here, but also all of the proportions mapped. You need to know where everything is sitting in space. And once you do that, you actually have a large portion of your drawing problems sorted. And it's this sort of accuracy that, even though it's complex, will allow you to go on and actually build a really, really complicated, detailed image, or whatever you want on top of. Again, this proportional stuff is the foundation that you can build a lot of great art on. It's a matter of building the complexity of your understanding of this. Think about the idea of starting just really understanding how to draw a character on a static plane. The next thing that we do, again, is just ratchet up that complexity. We then kind of say, hey, this is the one-dimensional version of the character. Once you do that, then you start layering on these extra concepts. What about if we twist that lower part of the character and we sort of just draw that from a different angle? Again, this is how a lot of good drawing happens. We just learn very, very simple things, and then we pile them on top of each other until they really start to work. So just make sure that you layer these concepts on top of each other, because I think this is where it often happens. This is where we build what I consider to be the most important aspects of a good drawing. In the first instance, what we need to think of is good proportion. And in the second instance, what we need to think about is good emotion and character acting. When we combine these, we get a great character posed well, that's accurate and drawn in a very, very nice way. That's it for this one. Let me know if you've got any questions below, etc. It'd be really, really great to hear if you want to, see some more explorations, just repeating the same thing, or whether you've got this. Let me know. But other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.